Hey guys, welcome to my Samoan language instruction on the perfective aspect for verbs. So basically you already know the imperfective forms for most of these words, if not all. Amata right here should look familiar to you. And the way that you perfect that in Samoan is you add on the suffix ina right here. So all of these verbs add an ina to make them perfective, okay? And so the only thing here is you're going to have to do some memorization. There's unfortunately no other way, in my opinion. This is probably the only way that you can do it correctly. And I'm not a big fan of memorization, and if you don't have to, but in this case you do need to. So what I encourage you to do is to pause the video and memorize all these perfective forms of the verbs on the left side. Okay, moving on to our next way of perfecting verbs, that we add the suffix a at the end of it, okay? And so you already know the word phi, at least you should, and then the way that you perfect that is phia, okay? And this means to do or say. And again, I'm going to ask you to pause the video at this point and memorize these perfective ways of saying these imperfective words, okay? So, for example, I can't just add an ina right there. I have to use it. The correct way to perfect va'i is va'aya. You can't just throw an ina on any word that you want to perfect, and you can't just throw an a on any word that you want to perfect. There's certain words that you have to use the correct suffix. So, pause the video at this point and memorize these words and their perfected forms. Okay, moving on to the next page. This is where you find some verbs. This is only some verbs can take either suffix, okay? So, for example, the verb I, you should be familiar with, is eat. And the perfective forms of this can either be aya or ina, okay? And so this can take any of the two different suffixes that we talked to just now. And I encourage you to pause the video and memorize the top part of this page, the top table, and work on these imperfective verbs that can take either suffix to make it perfective. Okay, now I hope you were able to memorize the top part. Now let's, one more table, guys. I know memorization is not a fun thing to do, but one more table to memorize. And here is some that just add extra sounds before the suffix. This is going to have to be something that you memorize as well. So alofa is on the left. The perfective form of alofa is alofangia, okay? This doesn't take either of these suffixes. It just kind of adds extra sounds into it, okay? And so I encourage you to, again, to pause the video at this point and memorize the bottom table. Okay, moving on to some of the more informal parts other than memorization in this video, which you do need to have memorized, by the way, if you're at this point. So if you haven't, go back and memorize those tables. But some of the consequences of considering the totality of the verb. So remember in my last video, perfective verbs take on the totality of the verb, which means you've completed the action. You can see in the way that you've described the sentence with that verb, you can see that you've began it, you're in the middle of it, and you've also finished it. You've completed the action of that, okay? But there are some consequences. So the perfective verbs are virtually always transitive. So if you remember in my last chapter on the transitive versus intransitive and precisely the transitive video, you'll remember that transitive takes on a different aspect than intransitive. So these are two little review words. There's intransitive and transitive. Intransitive means that a lot of times you'll have a preposition in there and that there's no object receiving action, whereas transitive is the opposite. It has an object that's receiving action, okay? So let's just, if that doesn't make sense to you, then you need to go back to those videos at this point and review. Okay, so basically transitive, like I said, so as we look at the box below, there's the imperfective form. The imperfective form usually takes on the intransitive form, and the perfective form usually takes on the transitive form, okay? So just remember that imperfective usually takes on the intransitive form and perfective usually takes on the transitive form. And right here, I'll show you some examples. This example right here in Samoan, the blue, na va'ai le tama I le tene, okay? Notice this is intransitive, okay? So I'm using the imperfective verb here. So I am using the imperfective verb va'ai. This is an imperfective verb, okay? And so my sentence structure then becomes the intransitive sentence structure. And the way that you can tell this is I have my tense marker, okay, that's na. Then my action, which is va'ai, so I'm just going to put ACT, or my verb. Then the next thing is the doer, or the noun phrase doer, or the subject, whichever one works for you. Doer is what I'm going to put. So this is what happens, and then I have a prepositional phrase that goes there. And you can see the prepositional phrase right here with the ile. That is what takes place in an intransitive sentence structure, is that you need to almost add a to the girl right here in this sentence structure. Okay? Let's go through the next example of our intransitive sentence structure, which uses an imperfective verb. So you'll know in the next blue sentence, olea valao le tina I le tama. Okay? So I'm using the imperfective form of the verb call, which is valao. I don't add any suffixes or anything to it, so that's the imperfective. But in that, if I use the imperfective form, then I also need to use the intransitive sentence structure. And that's why I have the mother will call to the boy right here, and that's why I have a prepositional phrase right there. If this confuses you, go back to my intransitive video, and it will help clear up any questions you might have. Okay, moving on to the perfective form. My perfective, if I use a perfective aspect of the verb, then I use the transitive sentence structure right here. So if I use perfective verbs, then I use the transitive sentence structure. And this is nice because I don't need to use prepositions, but I do need to change the verb itself. So right here, na va'aya, right here, let's highlight it. Na va'aya e le tama le tene. Okay? So in this sentence I just read, va'aya, this is the perfective form. This is the perfective form of the verb va'ai. Okay? Notice here I had va'ai. That is the imperfective form. But in this case I have va'aya. I added an a onto it, and that is the perfective form. So now I just use the transitive sentence structure. I use the transitive sentence structure, and I don't need the prepositional phrase to the girl. So this is na va'aya le tama le tene. The boy saw the girl. You don't need the preposition to. Okay, our next example of the perfective aspect in the transitive sentence structure is olea valauina e le tina le tama. Okay, notice I use valauina right here, valauina. This is the perfective form of the verb valao. And in this case, since I'm using the perfective form, I use the transitive sentence structure, so I don't need to say to the boy. I just say the mother will call the boy by saying olea valauina e le tina le tama. Okay, so this is what happens normally. Okay, so notice I have an asterisk right here, this little asterisk right here. This is where I explain the exception. Okay, so in exception to this, some verbs like maloloina act not as a transitive verb but as adjectives. Okay, so in that case you don't need to use the transitive sentence structure. It just acts as a adjective. Okay, so that maloloina is the one that you need to remember. If there's other verbs like that you notice that aren't taking the transitive sentence structure, then add that to your word bank. I'm not going to go through all of them because it'll take a long time to figure out which ones, but this is the general rule. This right here, this is the general rule. Okay, and moving on to our second, focusing on the totality of the verbs sometimes causes the meaning of the word to shift or at least broaden. So if I know my imperfective verb, va'ai, that means to see or catch sight of. Sometimes when I perfect that imperfective verb, it changes the meaning a little bit or it broadens it. Okay, so this isn't all the time. It doesn't change it all the time, but in some cases, and these are the most common cases that I'm giving to you on this page. So if I change va'ai to va'aya, it means to look at. It changes it a little bit. Okay. And if I say tali, it's to reply. Sorry, I can't speak English. Talia means to accept, okay? Mana'o means to want, and mana'omia means to desire or to need. Ilo means to perceive, and iloa means to know. Tu'u means to put or to leave, and tu'ua is to depart from, and tu'uina, the other form of the perfective form of tu'u, is to grant or to give. Okay, so these are the most common ways that the perfective form changes the imperfective meaning. It doesn't happen a lot, but like I said, these are the most common, and you need to remember these. These won't take you nearly as long to memorize as I asked you to memorize the tables at the beginning of the video. Okay, so moving on to our next page is just kind of a little bit of a summary. So the perfective aspect is indicated in Samoan by the addition of a suffix, usually a or ina, to the verb. The perfective aspect considers the total action and makes most verbs transitive. This is very important, okay? And broadens the meaning of some verbs, okay? So, I hope that recap helped. If not, go back and rewatch this video to help clarify some things that you may not understand fully. Okay, here's some example sentences. And basically, I'm going to just show you that the perfective form of these sentences. Okay, the missionary was called by the prophet. You can say this in the perfective form like such. So sa valaauina le faithiao e le perofeta. If I wanted to say the man has stopped the car in the perfective form, then it would be ua taufia e le tamaloa le taavale. Okay. And then she is reading the book is o lo'o faitauina e ia le tusi. Okay, so right now you might be asking the question, when do I use the perfective aspect and when do I use the imperfective aspect? Okay, don't worry about that too much right now. What I want you to remember is that you do change. Okay, I want that if you use the perfective aspect, then it's usually transitive sentence structure. And if you use imperfective, then it's usually intransitive. So the way that I like to remember it is the I's go together. So if we go back to this page right here, this I right here, this word imperfective starts with the I, and so does intransitive. It starts with the I. So that's how I remember it. Imperfective has an I, and intransitive has an I. And so that helps me remember. If I use imperfective verbs, then I use the intransitive sentence structure. Okay, but moving to this part, I don't want you to worry too much exactly on when to use which. We're going to be talking about that in the next video, okay? What I want you to do in this next part of the video at the bottom is to change the verb in the given sentences from the imperfective form to the perfective forms. Also make any other necessary changes, okay? So this means if I have the imperfective verbs, okay, I need to change them into their perfective form, and I need to make it into a transitive sentence structure. So imperfective can take on either transitive or intransitive, okay? But the perfective usually takes on the transitive sentence structure. So I'm going to give you the first one. Sa a'o le whaiaonga I le whaiwhiao tā lai. Or I whaiwhiao tā lai. There's no le there, sorry. I whaiwhiao tā lai. So the way that I would perfect this is I would change that a'o and I would add an I and a to it as such. You will note here that my a'o now becomes a a'oina in the perfective form. And you'll also note that I add an E right here, this E. This E marks the doer in my transitive sentence structure. The teacher is the one doing the teaching in this sentence structure, so I need to mark it with an E, because my sentence is transitive, and the reason why I'm using transitive is usually when I use the perfective verbs, then I need to use the transitive sentence structure. And then you'll also note that I don't have this I right here. I don't need the prepositional phrase to missionaries in the transitive form. Okay, so I just need to say sa oawina ele whaionga whaiwhiao tā lai. I don't need the two missionaries. Okay, so if this is confusing you, then you need to go back to my transitive versus intransitive video, and that will help with any confusion. At this point, I would like you to pause the video and come up with these these sentences on your own. So the left side will have a imperfective verb, and it will usually be intransitive, but there also are some transitive sentence structures in the imperfective form. And so my advice to you is there'll be like this first one right here. This sentence right here is it has an imperfective verb, okay? Fa'alongo is the imperfective verb, and it's also in the intransitive sentence structure. You'll note that there's a ya right there, and that kind of helps you know that this is in the intransitive sentence structure. But, so that's a hint, and so you need to change that intransitive sentence structure into a transitive. And then you'll note in this one, I have a na fa'amatala ele fayonga. This ele fayonga, this e right here, is marking my doer. This is how you know that this is a transitive sentence structure, and I don't need to change it from anything anymore. I just leave it in the same sentence structure, but I need to change the verb. So in this case, this would actually be a little bit easier. All I do is change the verb from an imperfective form to a perfective form. So you need to know. So if it's intransitive, I need to both change the imperfective verb into a perfective verb, and I also need to change the intransitive sentence structure to a transitive sentence structure. But one sentence is like this, I have an imperfective verb, but I have a transitive sentence already, so I leave it in the same sentence structure, but I just change the verb. So pause the video at this point, guys, and do the rest of these sentences on your own. Okay, so I hope you were able to figure out some of these. If not, I'm going to give you the answers right here, and I hope you were able to get the same thing that I was able to get. And if you weren't able to, don't worry, just figure out what you did wrong and remember it for next time. And until next time, guys, tofa soifua.